Okay, it's past 5, so I think we can start. Good morning again, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today for this, I'd say, timely discussion on carbon removals and the role of them in European climate policy. I am Fabiola De Simone, CDR policy lead at Carbon Market Watch, and I will just now introduce briefly the webinar and then give the floor to our speakers. I said timely because as the Commission is working on a policy package to implement the 2040 climate target, including a package and proposals on national targets for member states. The role of carbon removals and sequestration still remain a bit opaque, and even the continuation of binding LULUCF targets seem to be in danger. So today, Carbon Market Watch launches a series of reports looking more closely into how technological, natural-based, and mixed processes to remove carbon from the atmosphere are being integrated into national and EU policy and legislation, the reports look into whether this reliance is justified by proper assessments of potential trade-offs and negative impacts. So our aim today is not only to understand the extent of reliance of the EU and some countries on carbon removals and sequestration, but also to reflect on the broader legal and political implications of this reliance. We have a great lineup of speakers today. We will have some open remarks by MEP Lena Schilling, who's also hosting this event. And then we will have two presentations by Evan White, researchers are at the University of Oxford, and Daniel Ort, who's policy expert on carbon removals at Carbon Market Watch. Just a few housekeeping rules and reminders. We have a session, Q&A, dedicated Q&A session. So feel free to ask questions in the chat. And even to indicate the person the question is directed to. And the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared afterwards together with slides. I am not sure MEP Lena Schilling is already with us because apparently she's having some technical difficulties. If not, I could also start by giving the floor to Ivan, I think, so that he can give us already some context on countries' reliance, dependence on CDR, and important legal guardrails for this reliance and dependence of countries on CDR to meet their climate targets. As I said, Ewan is a researcher at the University of Oxford in international environmental law. Ewan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Let me just pull up this presentation and try and make all of the black squares that might obstruct your view disappear. So let me know if that works or not. Um, so yes, yeah, flag up if there's anything that you can't see, and I'll see if I can make it go away. But yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. Um, this is I think a really important discussion, and one that I'm happy to provide a bit of an introduction to get us rolling. So let's see if this is working. Right. So the outline of what I'm going to discuss today is first a very brief introduction to what carbon dioxide removal means, what it is that we're actually talking about here in a more concrete way, because I think sometimes these discussions are not really as grounded as they could be in the current situation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about why the nature and extent of CDR dependence in meeting climate targets matters. What are the sort of dynamics and the risks here? And finally, I'm going to come on to this concept that you mentioned, Fabiola, which is these sort of legal guardrails on CDR dependence, by which I mean constraints imposed by the legal framework at the international or regional level, which constrain the extent to which states can rely on carbon dioxide removal to achieve the targets that they've set. So first, on this point about what we mean when we talk about CDR, I think it's really important to flag up that there's really a very wide range of methods that people have in mind when they use this sort of umbrella term. And it's a very wide range of methods that has a very wide range of characteristics. And we're going all the way here from afforestation to the bottom, direct carbon capture. And I think we don't really have time to go into any detail on the characteristics of these different methods, but I think this helpful graphic from the State of CDR report really highlights some of the trade-offs that we see when we look at potential CDR options, right? So we have these categories of readiness, mitigation potential, and storage timescale. And what you see is that there are very rarely options, and I think in fact here there are none that optimize for each of these, right? So the options that can be readily achieved at the moment, which is largely in the LULUCF sector, the sort of afforestation, etc., and have major problems in terms of the storage timescale. Whereas other options that might be able to store carbon dioxide removal on a very long time scale are really quite low in the readiness stakes. And of course, there are also questions about the mitigation potential here. And I think one question about this image to me is whether this accurately reflects the mitigation potential, right? I think that's the issue on which we have the most uncertainty, which is the scale at which it will ultimately be possible to deploy these different methods. And I think before we move on to sort of the legal and policy context, on this point about the characteristics of CDR, I think it's really helpful to ground this discussion in the current situation with respect to these permanent methods of removals, this category that's often described as novel CDR. And what we see on the top bar here, this gray bar, is the current conventional removals. So largely that's in the LULUCF sector. And what we see is around 2.2 gigatons per year of removals that are already happening. And that's relative to global emissions of CO2 that are around 38 gigatons per year right now. So we're already looking at a level that is slightly dwarfed by the emissions. But even within this category, um, what you see is that the quantity of removals per year through these novel methods is really extraordinarily small at the moment, right? So we're not really talking about a set of actions that are already happening in any real significant scale in the world. We're talking about something that we're planning over the course of decades and something that actions are being put in place now to prepare for, but which isn't really here yet in a particularly strong way. And I think as we start to talk through these potential sort of future projections and targets and ideas about the contribution that CDR could make, it's really important to have this current context in mind so that we can grasp the sort of full extent of the challenge in achieving this sort of large scale deployment that is often discussed. So turning now to why CDR dependence matters. So a first really basic point here is that CDR is absolutely necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we have in the Article 4 of the Paris Agreement an aim of achieving the stabilization of greenhouse gas levels through reaching a sort of net zero. And that is not possible without there being something to balance out the remaining emissions. And that's where CDR comes into the picture. Um, and the point that I'd like to make here is that use of CDR in order to achieve net zero is one of two ways in which CDR is commonly talked about being used, right? So in this way of using carbon dioxide removals to balance residual emissions. We know that we need to do some of this. It's impossible to achieve the aims that we've set without doing so, but that different projections of the future rely on this to very different extents. And that's what you see in this image on the right-hand side here, right? So the darker pathway here shows a relatively small amount of residual emissions being balanced out by a relatively small amount of removals. And the lighter bars on either side of that show an alternative scenario where you're relying much more on carbon dioxide removal to balance out much greater levels of ongoing emissions. And ostensibly, these two different options could achieve this same temperature. That's what we see in this sort of orange line at the bottom here. But I think the word of ostensibly there is important because there are really significantly different risks between these two different options. And I think that that comes back to these characteristics that we've talked about in the last couple of slides, where there's quite a lot of uncertainty about whether or not we would, in fact, be able to deploy carbon dioxide removal at a large scale. And so the more you're depending on it, the more risk that you're generating that you ultimately won't achieve the temperature limit that you're aiming for if that carbon dioxide removal doesn't ultimately materialize. And I think the temporal dimension there is what I view as sort of the key dynamic in the sort of policy of carbon dioxide removal, which is that if we plan now to rely on later carbon dioxide removal scale up to counterbalance residual emissions, then we end up in a really significant problem if it doesn't materialize and we haven't put in place the measures that we would need to have much lower residual emissions, right? So there's a problem here if we put these policies in place now and are ultimately unable to achieve them. And this temporal component becomes even more significant when we turn to another use that CDR is often discussed in relation to, which is being used after emissions to reverse overshoot of a particular temperature, right? And again, this is something that we know if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we need to do. It's no longer possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees without reversing overshoot. We think that we've locked in something like 1.7 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And so this is something that we absolutely do need to do if we're to achieve the targets that we've set. But it's also something that can be like the reliance on carbon dioxide removal to achieve net zero, relied upon to very different extents, right? And so there are some possible futures where we rely very heavily on subsequent net negative emissions, these removals to reverse warming. Um, and as a result of that, are again vulnerable if those removals don't ultimately materialize. So what we see across both of these categories is that pathways which reduce their emissions less in the near term need to rely more on CDR deployment, and that really changes the risk profile of these sort of possible options for dealing with climate change. And so these are the papers that I've been involved in that explore the legal implications of this in more detail. So if you do want to take a look at the sort of the detail of the arguments here, I would refer you to them. But what I'd like to do in this final part is highlight a couple of the key sort of legal guardrails that we've identified in this work, which was sort of a collaboration between climate scientists and international lawyers. And the aim was really to work out, okay, given these characteristics of carbon dioxide removal and these characteristics of these possible futures that we might look at, what can we say about the extent to which states are free to do whatever they like here? Are states free to choose any of those sort of scenarios that I laid out over the last few slides? And the answer that we arrived at is that they're not, right? There are important guardrails that constrain the ways in which states can rely on carbon dioxide removal in pursuit of climate mitigation. And the first that I think is really important here is this idea of overshoot minimization, right? So we've seen that overshoot is now inevitable, that we are going to go over 1.5 degrees, and that we will need some CDR to bring us back below it if that's ultimately what we are able to do in the end. But that doesn't mean that it is compatible with the the aims of the Paris Agreement to um, rely to an open-ended extent on the potential to reverse overshoot, right? There are sometimes claims about pathways being 1.5-degree aligned, in spite of the fact that they very significantly overshoot 1.5 degrees before returning below it. And I think it's sometimes suggested that there's some freedom of movement generated in the Paris Agreement for that kind of strategy based on the fact that the temperature goal doesn't specify whether overshoot is allowed, right? There's an underspecification there. But what we discovered in our research, and there's a fuller explanation of this in those papers, is that the international climate framework requires the minimization of overshoot. And a simple way of explaining this is that the Paris Agreement's temperature goal isn't a standalone aim. It's an operationalization of a more fundamental objective that's in Article 2 of the UNFCCC, which is about preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, right? And we know that even if we are successful in ultimately reversing overshoot, the greater the magnitude and duration of the overshoot in the meantime, the greater the climate risks, right? So climate risks arise not just from it's permanently exceeding 1.5 degrees, but also from doing so temporarily. And so we have good reason to avoid that temporary exceedance. And this is something that's now been recognized by the Conference of Parties to the Paris Agreement in the COP30 decision in Brazil, which resolved to limit both the magnitude and duration of any temperature overshoot. And really, this sort of guardrail, I would regard as sort of providing a blocker to arguments which claim to be aligned with the Paris Agreement's goals just by virtue of the fact that they can point to the potential to ultimately reverse warming after a significant overshoot. And the second guardrail here that I'd like to highlight, and that's sort of my last substantive contribution here, which I think is really crucial in the context of the conversation we're having now, is the need for feasibility and coherence. So what we saw when we looked not only at the international legal framework, but also at human rights frameworks, including in the European Court of Human Rights, what we see is that it's not enough just to have a target for deploying CDR, either to address residual emissions or to reverse overshoot. You also need to actually put in place a robust strategy for achieving it. And we see that the pull towards this in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice in their characterization of the climate change regime, but also in the European Court for Human Rights in Klimas and Urinen, which made it clear that states must undertake genuinely feasible strategies, avoid a disproportionate burden on future generations, and act in an appropriate and consistent manner. And when we take these legal requirements and look at the characteristics of CDR, what this makes clear is that some of those trade-offs that we discussed earlier on, the uncertainties about the potential scale-up of carbon dioxide removals, make it really urgent that if you are going to rely on CDR to a significant extent, you need to show how you're going to deliver it. And I think it's in this context that it becomes really significant, these new series of reports that are coming out of Carbon Market Watch. And I look forward to hearing more in the subsequent presentations. And so to conclude here, over-reliance on CDR to achieve net zero and reverse overshoot exacerbates climate risks, right? This is something that we need to do, but it's something that we can very easily get carried away with when we're planning to do it in the future in a way that ends up compromising the stringency of emissions reductions in the present. And in our survey of sort of the legal context to this, we've identified that there are legal guardrails that constrain this reliance, but crucially, they don't provide precise quantitative limits, right? We're not going to be able to look at the legal framework and from that derive some precise limit to how much particular countries can rely on carbon dioxide removals. What we do find are these qualitative limits that are about the necessity of scrutinizing the feasibility and coherence of CDR strategies. And I think this is an issue that we're likely to see. Oh, sorry, that's my timer, so I'll wrap up. That's an issue that we're likely to see coming up increasingly in litigation. But obviously, the preferable option here is that it's internalized in the policymaking process. And I think I've had a sneak peek of the work that Daniel has been doing at Carbon Market Watch. And I think these really in-depth reports that get into the weeds of states' strategies and the methodologies and assumptions are really crucial here. I think this is what's needed now in order to put pressure on these strategies. And that's putting pressure on them both to achieve what they're setting out to achieve, but also if it turns out that is not possible, to redirect focus back to emissions reductions, which needs to be the centerpiece of any mitigation strategy. So I'll finish there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ewan, for this great presentation, for providing some context on the not only on again reminding about the definition and role of CDR, but also the legal framework and guardrails already existing on how to actually use it. Since Lena Schilling, MEP Lena Schilling joined us, I'd like to give the floor to her. Lena Schilling is member of the European Parliament and sits on the ENVI committee. She was also shadow rapporteur on the climate law revision last year, and we're very happy to have her with us. Maybe Lena, I'll ask you to share a few thoughts for now, and if you agree, I will get back to you after Daniel's presentation for some more detailed reaction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and sorry for the delay. I'm happy I had the chance to hear most of your presentation, even. As always in Strasbourg and technical issues, but nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here. I will also start a timer because, politicians tend to talk too long, and I will try not to do that. Thank you so much for hosting this event, and I think it's very important that we speak about the role of CDR in the new climate architecture, because that is what is keeping us busy right now. In this mandate and in the negotiations we had so far, we are seeing, and as also as Ivan was mentioning, we are more and more going into a direction of climate architecture where CDR is not just carbon removal, it's really a part of the strategy for decarbonization, and rely way too much on the perspective of having this as the golden bullet for all the problems we have. So that's maybe to say that right in the beginning, and then go a bit more into detail on what we have seen so far on the political level, because all of you, I'm sure, we have followed on the 2040 negotiations, the question of the Article 6, the international credits, and the role of permanent or not permanent carbon dioxide removals. And there we really had some issues, and I was also shocked to see that the impact assessments we are seeing from the Commission and the impact assessments that were provided were very clearly saying also that if we are relying too much on the CDR, that we get a problem. So to reach 90% net greenhouse gas emission reduction in 2040, the Commission bets on up to 400 million megatons of combined land-based and technological removals, which is already a lot, also because we know the question of land-based and how this will develop. But interestingly, the Commission does not foresee any improvement, and that's a bit where it gets bizarre, on the capacity of our forests and soils to absorb carbon. So we are betting on carbon dioxide removals. At the same time, we are on land-based removals and on the nature-based removals. We are not really seeing any development on things that would lead to actually having a base to come to these numbers. Then we can also talk about DAX and BECS. Maybe we do that after the presentation of Daniel. But all in all, and I think that's the message I want to give, now we think of how the post-2030 climate architecture can look like. We see that ETS is getting weakened. ETS 2 is now postponed. Let's see if it stays just with that postponement. I will bet on there will be more postponement. Then we have seen the question of the inclusion or not inclusion of international credits that are part of this permanent removals within the ETS or not. The Commission was again saying in an oral statement that they are not planning to include the international credits, so these carbon removal technologies, in the ETS. so far, but I would not bet on it. The Article 6 discussion and the legislation work will come in September, we guess. Let's see. But so there will be still this discussion on what CDR in definition, as Ivan was now saying it also, what is meant by that and what kind of technologies. Is it just DAX? Is it just BEX? Is it biochar? How far will we go? What kind of project will we then finance? Because that's maybe one more point that I want to make with this inclusion of the international credits within our climate targets, that basically also means that the quality of this different removal technologies will determine how much money the European Union will pay to other countries. So also there on this whole budget discussion, this whole discussion on how we will finance the decarbonization. And then, of course, also the question of if we remain and include and bet on the CDR technologies as a cornerstone and a stepping stone to achieve our decarbonization, then that also means that the linear trajectory within Europe is getting lower. Also, nothing I need to explain you, of course, you know that, but that's things that keep us busy. So the question for us is, how can this post-2030 climate architecture look like? Therefore, a big the three biggest things we are now looking into, and in all of them, CDR plays a big role, is the ETS, the national targets, and the governance regulation that will come up in Q4 of this year. Yeah, and I think there it will be very important to see and to push till then as much as possible that we remain the ambition in the decarbonization within the sectors, but also on the European level as on the ETS and so on. And therefore, I think, would need much more of and that's what we try to do here, a strategy to get the things done, because we are seeing what Merz is doing now with asking Ursula von der Leyen for a lot of things, and all of the more bigger picture political things that are happening that are just not good signs on the question of how our decarbonization paths will look like and what impact they will have, as also a lot of parts of the conservatives are saying that more or less CCU, CCS, and so on are the technologies that will save us, because we all know that's not true. Yes, maybe I will stop here and listen to Daniel and learn more about it. I hope that was insightful, and if there are any questions, please ask them later.
Thank you very much, Lena. Thanks for reminding about the relevance of this topic, especially in the context of the post-2030 climate architecture. And now that the Commission is preparing some proposals, this is really the moment for clarifying the role of CDR. I will give the floor now to Daniel, who is the lead author of the reports that we were mentioning and that are launched today, and will present the findings on whether European countries are over-relying on carbon removals and whether this reliance is justified or not. And yeah, after that, a short reaction by Lena maybe, and then some questions. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, Fabiola. And also thanks for the good political insight from Lena about this topic. Super interesting to hear. I'm quickly trying to share my screen. It works for everybody. All right. So as Fabiola said, today I have the privilege of shortly giving an overview over the reports we have published today, titled Leaning on Uncertainty, which is a series of 8 reports, and exploring the question if European countries are over-relying on carbon dioxide removals to reach their climate targets. I just want to give a short orientation about carbon removals. The presentation of Yuan was already super useful to provide a basis, I think, but just the main points. So what are carbon dioxide removals? They physically extract CO2 from the atmosphere and store it. There's an important political distinction in policy that we have to make between permanent removals and temporary removals, whereas permanent removals means removals where there's no reversal within climate-relevant timeframes. The IPCC clearly states that CDR is a supplement to emission cuts and not a substitute. And since we're talking about countries' climate strategies, carbon neutrality goals is a huge topic. So to reach climate neutrality, this requires residual emissions to be balanced by some form of CDR. And if we're looking at pathways that stay within 1.5 or reverse overshoot as quickly as possible, they all pathways that are credible rely on some form, some method of CDR. But, and that's the important part, the scale, the timing, and the choice of the methods we use matters. And this is the core point of this report. Unrealistic promises of CDR can delay emission cuts and potentially even, lead us to more damage, not more damages from climate change and more severe climate change. So the overall message here is emission reductions must stay the priority. Which brings me to my next slide, which is looking at the EU. That was basically the first exercise we did when starting with this report is, okay, EU-wide, how does it look like? What is the Commission thinking? How is the Commission thinking about it? And if we look at the impact assessment from the European Commission on the 2040 target, we see these are 4 different scenarios they presented in impact assessments, and the 2040 target is more or less aligned with scenario 2 and scenario 3, somewhere in between those, depending of how they are actually translated now into national targets. As we see, mainly agri emissions persist at 2050, which would have to be balanced by LULUCF and industrial removals. This is what the European Commission calls permanent removals, and here it's specifically BECCS and DACs that are in the projections. If we zoom into this EU-wide reliance, we see that the green bar here is LULUCF removals, and the orange bar would be industrial removals in megatons CO2 equivalents on the right side, quantified, and on the left side, they're expressed in relation to EU-wide 1990 emissions in 1990, and comparing those with the reliance in 2050. So for permanent removals, this would be 2.3%, and for the LULUCF sink, that would be 6.8% of 1990 emissions. So in total, if we're thinking about a 90% emission reduction in 2040 and a bit more in 2050, then these total projected removals in 2050 would amount to 9.2% of 1990 emissions. So the big question we ask ourselves here is current reliance actually feasible, thought through, and sustainable? And to answer this question, the first question we had to answer, what actually is over-reliance? How do we frame this? And in the report, we frame it as a reliance on volumes that exceed established feasibility constraints or developed without adequate assessments. So you see there's this twofold question of over-reliance. One part is the substantive over-reliance, which would mean that non-feasibility of the projected plans is actually clear and stated by authoritative assessments. And the second part would be the procedural over-reliance, which means countries make poor assessments or are doing insufficient implementation, which lead to high delivery risks. So planning on carbon removals, but not doing the actual work countries would have to do in the actual planning work. So there's a high risk that those are actually not delivered in the end. The methodology for the report, to answer this core question of how responsibly selected countries are relying on carbon dioxide removals to reach their climate commitments. We first had to make a country selection and figure out which countries and which jurisdictions we want to look at. So as you see here on the right side, we chose 6 different countries and the EU, represented by mainly European Commission and publications. And so this is mainly based on the extent of reliance and the timely availability of data. So we base this a lot on long-term strategies, LTLEDs, NECPs, and going further, also seeing what kind of publications and what kind of assessments these documents actually refer to, and look into the assumptions behind those. So this would be the evidence from official national climate planning documents and key sources. And to supplement this and actually bring in some new information that wasn't prior publicly available, there were requests for additional information to ministries, which resulted in more than 70 documents being made public, being sent to us to analyze, which actually enhances analysis quite a bit. So to get into the findings, what was the takeaway of these? What were the findings we found in the documents we looked over? So generally, for all three, like permanent removals, LULUCF sinks, and more overarchingly, we found multiple shortcomings in these plans. For instance, for permanent removals, premature reliance or very early reliance that was actually deemed unfeasible by scientific assessments. For LULUCF sinks, for instance, a big part, and that's already very, very obvious looking at the plans, is the lack of action and actually relying on land sinks to be available in 2040, 2050, but the necessary action and the necessary policy is actually not in place. But also overarching issues like policy that is disconnected from scientific advice or fragmentation of information on CDR plans, which relates to transparency, which is an issue. If plans are not transparent, plans actually do not outline assumptions well and show which assessments have been done, then it's hard to assess these plans and to put public scrutiny on these plans. So all these findings show us that CDR is more used as a gap filler than actually a serious political commitment. If we look at the countries we analyzed, and this is basically a scorecard of the key dimensions, we found that countries did or did not look into deeply or did not perform well in. And I don't want to get into detail of the different dimensions here, but just as a picture, we can see that in many dimensions, countries fall short in, but they perform differently. So like if you see in almost each dimension, one country actually performs well, has no limited shortcomings, so show that actually it is possible to perform well in them, but a large part of countries actually does not make the necessary assessment, does not have a plausible timeline for permanent removals, or the policy is not coherent with the impact assessments. So this one shortcoming is actually poor planning in countries, which we see, for instance, in low transparency, so conflated CDR methods and undisclosed assumptions in the strategies. Then absent assessments. So in many strategies, countries rely, for instance, on BECS while not actually looking into where does the biomass come from, and for DECS, for instance, where does the renewable energy come from? How much do we need? Which other uses would this conflict with? And then one big issue is the storage bottleneck for permanent removals, which would need geological CO2 storage. And a lot of countries we looked at actually rely on international storage to be available. Often the North Sea is mentioned as potential storage basin, but the assessments of how do we transport it there, how much geological storage is actually available in total, and how does the competition between countries look like is something that is in many cases not assessed. And then the big question of climate neutrality goals of countries. While many have them, and this is a good thing that they set themselves climate neutrality goals, but the question is how well are they defined and what does it actually mean? And in many cases, or actually almost all cases, residual and hard to abate emissions, so these that would remain or are technically and societally impossible to abate, are very vaguely defined. So we don't know, the countries do not assess how many emissions actually remain and how much CDR would be needed to reach the climate neutrality goals. And then the second layer of this assessment is the deficient delivery in countries. So countries making plans and countries making the assessments, knowing what they have to do, but then actually in the delivery, in the outcome, in the policy they provide, they're deficient. So one element would be that countries are actually relying on land-based things to grow. At the moment, we see that they're shrinking. A lot of times there is scientific advice coming in from, for instance, the ISABCC, the European scientific advisory report on climate change. This is for the EU level, that says clearly, okay, countries have to reduce logging, countries have to reduce harvesting, but this is not being done, and no policies or like not even assessments how this could be done are made in many of the countries we reviewed. Then there's the political governance of permanent CDR, which speaks about which is about are actually targets about CDR, how much CDR are should be reached, is there political commitments about it, which methods are supposed to be used. And at the moment, this political governance is neither there on EU nor on member state level, at least in the countries we looked at. And as a third point, existing policies generally, we see that they're disconnected from science and impact assessments. So even if there are well-done impact assessments and well-done scientific studies on CDR, often countries' policies and countries' actions are disconnected from these. So to give you a short look into countries, actually, and I don't have much time, so I'm just going to try to keep it short. For Finland, for instance, two major issues were that they were disregarding scientific advice to reduce logging. As I said before, this is like advice coming from the Finnish climate change panel, which gives expert advice to the government. And while they have been clearly providing recommendations to at least moderate logging, this has not been implemented in policy. And the second part is that Finland is relying on underassessed geological storage abroad, as I said before, just assuming it will appear and materialize, while actually assessments are not being done if this is the truth and how much will be available. For Ireland, there's the reliance on unrealistic levels of afforestation. So meaning Ireland has quite a large gap in its second carbon budget, which is from 2026 to 2030. And part of this would be filled because they have a part of it that is not allocated to a specific sector. So not really a plan for, which is quite a large part of their emissions. And Irish plans show that a large part of this should be filled with afforestation in the next years. And we showed, and the current situation shows that these afforestation levels are not being fulfilled. So this seems quite unrealistic at the moment. And the same goes for Ireland and Austria, actually, that they rely very prematurely on permanent removals, so very early, without having the assessments done on if the injection of these captured CO2 into geological storage is actually possible, and the timelines are there and technology is there. And the second point on Austria is similarly to Finland, is the reliance on underassessed geological storage abroad, as I noted previously. But the good message from these reports is that better CD governance is actually possible. We identified multiple. Can you still hear me? Because my laptop just froze. Okay, good that I'm still there. Just need to go to my presentation again. Apologies. The good message is that better good CDR governance is possible. And if we look at the good practices we identified, for instance, that Austria actually is starting or like included a precise and science-based definition of hard-to-abate emissions in their strategies, shows that governments can do better, and governments can actually implement the necessary assessments and implement better governance. If you look at Italy, for instance, they show that they have a very conservative timeline for permanent removals, and the permanent removals that they want to deploy are tied to specific existing industrial sites that are partly already running, and since the timeline is large enough, at the moment delivery risks are way lower than in other countries. And for Finland, they actually revised expectations of permanent CDR downward because new evidence came in and because new assessments were made, and we're making clear, okay, the timelines we foresaw are actually not realistic. So they significantly revised their expectations downwards, which is important good practice. So from good practices, we come to our recommendations. I'm going to wrap up quickly. I think I'm almost already over time. So first and foremost, for permanent removals, they need to be captured into separate binding targets to make sure, first of all, they don't interfere with emission reduction efforts, and second of all, to also make sure that actions on all three fronts, that is permanent removals, low LUCF sinks, and emission reductions, are actually progressing. Then resting projections on detailed and complete feasibility assessments. At the moment, there's a huge assessment gaps in country strategies that needs to be filled. Third is acknowledging that there is a CO2 storage bottleneck, and especially in the short and medium term, this will be limited and has to be underpinned. If relied on permanent removals, this has to be underpinned by plans. Where will these removed CO2 actually go, and where will it be transported? How much does this cost? And is competition internationally actually a problem? As a
Daniel,
fourth
sorry
point,
for interrupting.
yes.
I think we're still on the slide with good practices. Not
Okay.
sure you can move to the next slide.
Thanks for telling me. I'm trying to represent again. Do you see my recommendation slide? Wait.
No, we're still seeing the good practice. But otherwise, we
Okay,
will also send the slides afterwards. So
that is true. Because we share quickly. Wait. Okay. I think this should work. Okay.
we cannot see your slides now at
Not
all.
at all.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm just gonna finish without presentation then. That's fine. So as a fourth point, it would be that I'm just drawing up my slides. Consolidating and clarifying CDR documents would be a practice that would be needed. So at the moment, a lot of information is spread out over multiple documents, multiple assessments, multiple studies, sometimes incoherent, even within the same documents. So consolidating this and clarifying what is actually being relied on would be needed. Then defining residual emissions transparently and with public involvement. And as a last point, restoring the lands and with binding policy actions. So not only having targets, but also making policy actions and what lies beyond below these targets actually binding, and make sure this happens. And based on these all points, taking another look into the emission reduction toolbox. So actually, after making good assessments on CDR, looking into, okay, if this is the sustainably feasible volume of CDR we have in the next decades, do we actually need more emission reductions? And then take a look back at those. Then yeah, with this, I thank you for your attention, and I give the word off to you, Fabiola, again.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this very comprehensive presentation. I think that triggered many thoughts and questions in the chat. I actually would invite you, Daniel, if you want to respond to some of those very quick questions about methodologies in case, but then we can answer most of the others in the Q&A. So I would like to give the floor now back again to Lena for reaction, and maybe then before you leave, ask you a few questions first, because we know that you have other commitments.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's very good to have things like this prepared and in place when the big discussions are coming up and starting. I mean, we know they're already running for a while, but now is a quite decisive time. So it's also very interesting to hear. I would also be interested to hear some questions of the methodology, but in case I have to leave, my assistant will stay here, because I think also on the country perspective, that of course is important when we look into the question of the national targets and the national plans and the revision of it, because as we have seen, the different countries have different usage and different expectations on the CDR use. And at the same time, and that's maybe a political point I still want to make, we see that a lot of, or some of the companies that are really in the hard to abate industry, Austria, we see had a better definition of hard to abate than other countries. They can actually be allies. Like we have a concrete company, Holcim in Austria, that is actually trying to say, hey, we really need to be careful with CDR and where to use it, because we are that hard to abate industry and we know we don't have that much capacity for the storage and so on. So actually that is something I want to mention, because there are sometimes unlikely alliances that are helping in these findings, and especially then looking into the different findings of the country with the political view of what we need to assess and what we need to do, maybe that we will definitely use. So thank you so much for also providing it. I think the main point I will take away and I also want to reflect on is the gap filler instead of political commitment, because that's a bit the overarching point. Also the question on if what we are doing besides the impact assessments on policies and the things we put forward, if they are still in line with scientific based evidence or not. And I would say often they are not anymore, because other things seem to be politically more relevant in this house, but also in the commission right now than scientific evidence based policies, which is quite hurtful and something we, I think, should fight against. And therefore also on what you are saying with the different things and the storage of bottleneck on capacity and the question of how impact assessments are designed, that are points we should follow up on, because I think it's very clear that there is a job to do and there we can get also better. Then on the whole question of DAX and BEX and how that will be included, there also, I have actually a question for the experts here in the round. Very good to use that. On the inclusion on international credits and the question of DAX and BEX and this Article 6 discussion, I would like to hear from you how you think of the capacity, because in everything we did in the 2040 target and the question of how to get to the 90%, we now have this 5% plus eventually 5% for member states on permanent removals or such technologies. And there my question would be in DAX and BEX, and what kind of permanent removal technologies could add up to 5%? We know how much that can be, right? So to hear a bit your perspective on it, if that is actually feasible or not. And then also, I mean, and that's a bit what also Daniel was mentioning in another term, but I think one of the biggest problems we have is also that the member states are not acting up, even not to their decarbonization goals. So just one example, when we talk about the ETS and the use of the revenues for industrial decarbonization, we now had last year the first annual report on the decarbonization, how this money of the ETS revenues actually spent. And there we saw, as an example, in Italy, that they are allocated around 9% in the revenues to decarbonization. So most of it they are just not using. So also the member states are just not meeting up to what we agreed on. So there are a lot of missing links to get actually to the more ambition. And I think to Daniel's last question, shouldn't we do more other work in decarbonization, and shouldn't we follow up on the targets we promised? I would say yes, but therefore we would need more scientific based politics, which would mean we need a 2030 architecture where we are actually strengthening the effort sharing and the ETS and other parts. But the problem is right now that I'm not sure how it will go with the effort sharing. I'm not sure how it will go with the ETS. And then we have these different kinds of architecture where the question is, do we have a net wide targets? Do we have do we keep the effort sharing? How will it go? What other kinds of architecture could look like? And there then the question of CDR will be important, but very good you looked into some of the countries. Yeah, and we will look into the numbers, and there I will stop because sorry, we have now 140 minutes of voting session and I got the voting list a few minutes ago, so we need to check.
Okay, Lena, completely understood. Are you still available to just answer maybe one question before you go? Indeed, on your last point specifically, that was also asked in the chat about maybe your thoughts on the European Commission's idea of merging the effort sharing and the LULUCF regulation, and maybe also how do you see the potential of the governance regulation clarifying or guiding member states to do these assessments for CDR?
Yes, maybe starting with the governance regulation, I see a big potential there, but we need to prepare it early. I think that's a bit also for my time frame. I will negotiate the governance regulation on behalf of the Greens, and we will start with the preparations pretty much in 2-3 weeks, because I think it's very important that we are a bit ahead of the stream. So also your findings will be helpful there. And we are already in talks with the Commission. But yes, I think that's exactly the point. The governance regulation could also be a tool to have first better impact assessments, but also a clear vision of what the phase out and the decarbonization actually can mean. But therefore, we also need to look a bit into what's the position on the different member states and so on, and where are we standing now. And then on the thoughts on the European Commission and combining ECR with LULUCF, it's guys, what should I tell you? I think the most important or the most difficult part is that LULUCF per se is pretty much under attack right now. And on what I'm seeing is that we need to keep, I would say we should keep them separated. And I would say I think we should strengthen the effort sharing regulation even more with sectoral targets that are very clear. And then the LULUCF, my problem is if we merge that now and if we open up both these things, the danger of that both is getting weakened in a mixed up, mash up target without clear solutions is huge. If the political situation would be different, if the political majorities would be different, I could think of something like that. But in the situation we are now in, I think the most important thing is that we try to keep the targets understandable, and also for us follow that we can follow if that is a progress or not. Because if we now mesh up all the targets, my fear is that all of them will get weakened. But that's a bit my trauma of the last 2 years, I would say. But I think we share that trauma at least. So yeah.
Totally, definitely, I would say. Okay, thank you so much, Lena. Thanks for being with us, and good luck with your work. Bye bye. So I'd now address some of the many questions that were asked in the chat, maybe starting with Ivan. We got a first question from Niels on if you can specify and quantify the magnitude of overshoot that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. And maybe I would also ask you a second question on whether you have a view on these different roles and time frame for nature-based solutions and more technological solutions. Do they have different roles to play, and whether how we can rely on them? Can also ask this to Daniel after, but happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, both very good questions. I'll start with the question about the extent of overshoot. I think the first point, okay, maybe I'll answer first at the global level, and then address this somewhat more complicated question of what that means for states in the EU. So at the global level, the starting point has to be that as a matter of fact, no overshoot is compatible with the UNFCCC, right? So the interpretation that we've reached in the paper that I discussed is that any overshoot of 1.5 degrees is to some extent a failure in collective efforts to achieve the objective of the UNFCCC, right? And this is a situation that we should not have found ourselves in. As a matter of fact, we have, and now that some level of overshoot is inevitable, the question that we need to grapple with is the extent of it, right? But by virtue of the fact that any overshoot was a failure, it follows quite naturally from that the amount that you need to prevent is as much as you possibly can, and there are ways of quantifying that in a relatively precise way. and it's by looking at what it's still possible to do. So at the time of the IPCC's sixth assessment report, that would have been, for example, the C1A pathways, which limited overshoot to 0.1 degrees above 1.5 degrees for no more than a decade. Um, that is now, I think, increasingly slipping out of reach, but there's been updated analyses that suggest that overshoot can still be limited to a maximum of 1.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So it's as you can see from that shift, it's a moving goalpost, right? Because it's the question is, well, how much can we still possibly do? Um, but I think turning to this question of what that means for the national level, obviously the process of moving from these global pathways to national level implications is one that involves quite complicated distributional questions, right? And one implication of that actually is that even if it's not possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees at a global level, it might still be possible for particular states to act with equivalent ambition to those more ambitious targets that are now out of reach at the global level. So the relationship there is slightly complicated, but the overall message here is actually really simple, which is that you need to reduce your emissions as much as you possibly can. You can't rely on CDR bailing you out in future, and you can't, I think, crucially, rely on this argument that you are aligned with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal just by virtue of the fact that you can point to some pathways that involve very significant amounts of overshoot. Those are not aligned with the objectives of the climate change treaties as a whole and the urgent need to avoid the climate risks involved in that kind of gamble. And then turning to this question about the relationship between different sorts of carbon dioxide removals, I think this is a really important one. Um, I think I saw this in several questions, but one of them was through the lens of the fact that LULUCF removals are this sort of tried and tested thing that we know works. And on that basis, why shouldn't we rely on them? I think that for me comes fundamentally back to this question of permanence, right? So there's a real mismatch between carbon dioxide emissions, which remain in the atmosphere for thousands of years, and the removals that can be achieved in the LULUCF sector, which, as we saw in that first image that we flagged up, and as Daniel mentioned, are much shorter in timescales, and they're highly vulnerable to being reversed, including by the effects of climate change itself. So I think maybe an important distinction is between doing LULUCF removals to the extent possible, and certainly there was a point in the question about um, moving from some intensive animal agriculture to uh, ways of using land that have these co-benefits for biodiversity, as well as temporarily storing carbon. I think that's absolutely right and absolutely something that we should be putting a lot of focus on. But I think there's a distinction between that and relying on the land sink, right? And especially if what we're talking about is relying on the land sink to compensate for ongoing emissions that will be permanently in the atmosphere on sort of relevant timescales. We're talking thousands of years. And it's that reliance that's the problem rather than sort of initiatives to bolster the land sink. And I think that's a really important distinction. So that would be my main thought on that point, but I'm happy to come back in if there's any other sort of follow-ups related to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive, great answer, if you ask me. There is a follow-up question on this overshoot, but maybe by Niels. Yeah, maybe let's tackle this. Sorry, Daniel, for a second, since we talked about the overshoot, even if it's okay with you. And like, how would you argue for overshooting court? What's your legal case?
I think this might be a more sort of comprehensive discussion than we can really get into here. But I do think that the question is pointing to like a quite significant difficulty in sort of the legal sort of framework that we have established that doesn't provide some sort of hard and fast limit to the level of overshoot that's permissible, and it does complicate those kind of cases. There are sort of ongoing discussions about how you would bring that kind of challenge to the use of a pathway that involves very significant amounts of overshoot. And I think a lot of the points we've raised here today would go towards those challenges. But one point I'd like to make in response is um, it would not be helpful if we did have an absolute quantitative limit on the amount of overshoot that was allowed or permissible. Say we had an agreement as part of the Paris Agreement that you absolutely couldn't exceed 1.7 degrees. But what do you do once it's become inevitable that you will, right? There's an ambiguity and difficulty introduced by the flexibility with which we've set up these systems, but that also enables it to respond to new conditions. And so I realize that's to some extent an unsatisfying response, but it wouldn't help us much if there was a clear line, because going at the rate we are, we're likely to exceed it. So having a flexible regime that allows us to respond to these developing situations and make arguments about minimization of risk, I think is the best that we can hope for. And I think that there are challenges being articulated at the national level that are starting to make this point quite effectively. But yeah, I think going into it in full would go beyond this discussion, but very important question. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan. Very interesting point of view on this overshoot discussion. Okay, I have some questions for Daniel as well on specifically on the methodology of the report. There were some questions on the type of data that was used for the analysis and why some specific jurisdictions were chosen for the analysis. If you can elaborate a little bit more on that before tackling other questions.
Okay. So for the type of data that we looked into, we started out with looking at countries' NSCPs, long-term strategies, and biennial transparency reports, which are all publicly available documents. So this makes it easy. And also, of course, looking at national climate plans, also looking at what national scientific advisory boards say to these topics. And then, as I said in the presentation, supplemented by documents we received through a request for additional information. These were like for each country, these were completely different documents. They're not necessarily comparable in that sense, but the information, basically the background information behind NCPs and LTSs, and asking what assumptions and what assessments actually this reliance on CDR was based on. That, for instance, was for Ireland a report, a slide deck from a consultancy, as an example. And why we chose the countries we chose, it's important to say here that this is not a representative sample for Europe or a sample that is representative of best or worst performers. So this was actually chosen on, okay, how high is the reliance from these countries on CDR, both on permanent and LULUCF CDR, and is the information available? Are there, for instance, NCPs, LTSs already published? We based this on a data set by researchers from the University of Oxford, first of all, and then started going from there. And this was a text review rather than a quantitative analysis.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the clarifications. I would like now to tackle the question about maybe residual emissions. So first, to Daniel again about Austria's robust definition of residual emissions. What was it? If you can elaborate a bit more on that. And also there is a question about Italy's conservative timeline for permanent CDR. I don't know if you can respond right now. Otherwise, feel free to stick to the residual one, and then you can answer in writing.
Yep. So about Austria's definition of residual, or they call it hard to abate emissions. Looking into the carbon management strategy, which is a document published by the Austrian government, where they outline how they want to go about it, what the strategy is to provide CDR, but also CCU and CCS. So there's some conflation here between the three. And the definition is split up the definition of hard-to-abate emissions is split up into industry and non-industry emissions, which is already an important distinction, I think. Of course, the journey here is still ongoing, and I think the last word about the definition has not been spoken yet. But we think it is important to, first of all, that it is based on science, so based on scientific assessment, it's very well outlined where this definition is coming from. And while it is, of course, a political decision how hard-to-abate emissions are framed, and especially comparing the definition on the treatment of hard-to-abate emissions in Austria with how other countries treat it, makes Austria actually stand out. And I'm not saying that Austria has it figured out and it's perfect on its definition here, but that is far ahead of the countries. So in the second part of the question was, could you remind me?
It was about Italy's conservative timeline for permanent CDR.
Oh, thanks. Yes. So in Italy, Italy has an advantage here, of course, because it has the Ravenna hub, which is a geological storage site that is quite big and compared to other countries, again, quite well explored. And what Italy does that other countries, Italy does not what other countries do is actually rely on permanent CDR very early on, like in 2030 or 2035. And the reliance here is very minimal. So comparing this, for instance, with Ireland or Finland, I think, relying on severe volumes of permanent CDR in 2035, which is their carbon neutrality target. This differs if you look at Italy. And Italy, of course, the timeline is later, so rather scaling up these permanent removals around 2050. So compared to other countries, again, this is more conservative. And at the moment, looking at the scientific assessments made in Italy and also like expert advice, there is no reason or no clear delivery risks on this. But of course, it's still uncertain. We're not going to get, as Ewan said before, we're not going to get rid completely of uncertainty, but it is about risk management. The risk will always be there. The question is, how do we treat this risk? How would you manage it?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very clear answer. I would like to also get maybe Ivan's thoughts on the question on residual emissions, and specifically also to address this question from Sophia on the process to define residual emissions. How can we define them? Who should define them? Should we start defining them? What do you think, Ivan?
Thank you. Yeah, another very complicated question. I think one thing that strikes me from this conversation so far and from Daniel's findings is that any sensible definition of residual emissions needs to begin with an assessment of CDR capacity, right? It needs to begin from the question of, well, how much of this does it look like we can actually do? And what uses are we putting it to, right? And I think that what is really important when there are arguments about whether CDR should be used for particular purposes. So I think Lena made this point about concrete that I think was really important, right? That there are certain things that seem to be very, very, very difficult to decarbonize. And given the limited resource that is carbon dioxide removal, we should be prioritizing for not only those things that are difficult to decarbonize, but also those things that we really, really need, right? So there are some things that are difficult to decarbonize and sort of essential for human well-being. There are other things that are difficult to decarbonize and potentially that we could stop doing to the same extent, right? And I think for me, the question isn't necessarily about arriving at a very precise quantification of the appropriate amount of residual emissions. It's that this discussion should direct us towards looking very hard at the activities that we're assuming will still be continuing by a year like 2050, and looking at the social choices rather than just technological choices that are implicit in having, for example, very significant emissions from animal agriculture or aviation ongoing at that point in the future. And maybe one point to flag here in terms of something leaning towards better practice in doing this kind of assessment. I also had a look at the Commission's environmental impact assessment for the 2040 target, and I found the life scenario that they looked at there really interesting, which was a scenario where they relaxed some of the assumptions that are commonly involved in these scenarios about lifestyle change not happening, right? So generally, these scenarios assume pretty minimal changes in the lifestyle changes, people in society, in particular in terms of transport and diet. And what it found when it relaxed these assumptions, in the lifestyle scenario, was that the reliance on carbon dioxide removal was really considerably lower. So I think this is, yeah, a two-prong investigation, right? It's how much CDR do we think we can actually do, and how much do we really need all of these activities that we're claiming are necessarily going to be balanced by carbon dioxide removal? And approaching it from those two directions at once, I think, gets you somewhere towards the answer.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I totally agree with that. Daniel, is there anything that you also want to share about this, on whether, like, who should be involved in this process to define residual emissions should be a political choice, rather than, as Ivan was also saying?
I would say in widely I agree with you and about of course residual emissions should be based first on how much CDR can we actually do and is feasible. But since we don't have these assessments yet, and these assessments will change over time, we know this. One thing I think that is clear, that we will have to do loops and we have to go back to the assessments we made, revise them, make them better, both for emission reduction. So how many emissions reductions can we actually do? This is something that will also hopefully progress as technology, as policy, as society progresses. So I fully agree with this twofold analysis. I think it's very important that the public is involved in this process, and there is somewhat of a part for civil society in this. That this process is transparent, so it's clear who decides, how it is decided on, and which assumptions and which technologies are actually involved in this residual emissions number that we end up in the end. And it also potentially, it's not a number, maybe it's a corridor that leaves some space for both political negotiation, but also technology to evolve.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. I have another question for you, asked by Wenand, on whether you have the most striking example of a country leaning on uncertainty. If there was anything really, really big that you would like to stress.
Oh, that's a good question. Thanks. I would say the one example that struck me the most would be the example of Ireland, which at the moment in its plans already seems to rely on CDR around 2030, so very early on, and also compared to other countries, quite a large volume of CDR. So at the moment, it seems very unfeasible. The scientific assessments behind this that we received through requests for additional information were also very clear that this is highly unrealistic. There's high delivery risk, and I would say this is something that at the moment is the highest disconnect between actually what is feasible and how countries go about their climate planning and the treatment of CDR. And maybe as a second example is the case of Finland when we talk about the LULUCF sink. What is striking here is that it's very clear that Finland has a huge problem with logging, and it's undermining its LULUCF sink in the last years, and this seems to just be ongoing. And scientific assessments and scientific recommendations have been very clear about actually the only way to reach its climate neutrality target in 2035 realistically and more or less safely would be to reduce these logging levels and actually, yes, harvest at least a little bit less. And it's very clear that it makes it very clear that this would be feasible, but this is just being ignored or not considered properly by governments. So I would say these are the two country cases that struck me the most in the analysis.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We addressed most of the questions. There are few remaining. One also asked by MEP Lena Schilling herself on this relation, this linkage between CDR and the role of international carbon credits in the 2040 framework. This is a bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but since we have a bit of time, we could also say something about that. I'm also happy to give my thoughts on the topic because I've been working on it, and then feel free to jump in. As such, the climate law doesn't really put these two provisions together, as in the one on the use of international credits and the role of carbon removals in the ETS. They are two different provisions in the climate law amendment. However, so as such, there is no direct interlinkage between the two things. That said, there is still a lot of uncertainty about how international credits will be integrated in the climate architecture. And of course, one way that Lena was also mentioning is the potential integration of the credits in the ETS. That would be really bad. And also the Commission is pushing against this option. But then I think that the link with CDR would be more on the type of credits that the EU could rely on. So whether we're talking about indeed only permanent removal credits or other type of credits, and as well the quality criteria that are established for those credits, will those be based on the CRCF methodologies? That would actually be a bit bizarre, since the CRCF is very much based on EU legislation. So there is a link there, but that has to be clarified by the Commission soon. I don't know if you guys want to say anything about that. Otherwise, I'd like to ask you some very final thoughts on this before I wrap up with a few points. Final thoughts on your recommendations again, your one recommendation, your one takeaway. Maybe Iwan, you want to start?
Sure. I think my one takeaway is that so one of the papers that we mentioned, we did this review of all of the long-term strategies that had been submitted to the UNFCCC. And this is not something that's just focused on Europe. There's really pervasive gaps in what states are planning to do. And I think it all comes back really for me to Daniel's point about CDR in these strategies not being a political commitment, but rather being a gap filler. And that does seem to be the central role that it's playing. And I think that this new report is a really helpful illustration of how deep that goes, right? The more of these documents you're able to take in, and the transparency requests made to governments really helps zero in on this point and makes it really clear that there's a really serious distinction between what we are claiming we're going to be doing and the actual operationalization. And I think However sort of sticky and ambiguous these points are about the precise levels of carbon dioxide removal that are appropriate, the key point here is that we can continually test whether the claims made about what is going to be delivered are in fact being substantiated, whether there's been assessments of whether it can be done. And I think this kind of report and the questions we're asking today, to me, seem the most promising line of argument for putting emissions reductions first. And with that, I'll pass to Daniel.
I would say the one important point at the moment, looking at the political developments, especially now on EU level, would be that with the packages that come out now, I mean, first of all, of course, speaking about international credits, refraining from using them and keeping them out as much as possible. The part of CDR that is in them still a big question mark. And second of all, the current discussions about the ESR and the LULUCF, so the effort sharing regulation and the LULUCF regulation, which LULUCF setting targets for net removal levels in countries. And it's really important to keep in mind that, first of all, this distinction, this separation between temporary removals in the LULUCF and emission reductions, this needs to stay. If we don't have this, then actually this means revising down the ambition level for emission reductions. And at the same time, as we see countries rely on both permanent removals and temporary removals, now would be the time to actually set a direction. I'm not saying a clear target for the next 5 years, but like at least set a direction for countries where this journey should be going collectively as EU, and making sure that these assessments are actually being done. The governance regulation plays a huge part in this. Is an opportunity to actually make it more explicit which kind of assessments countries have to be doing on CDR, and also strengthen compliance. So at the moment, a lot of assessments are already mandatory by the governance regulation, but the quality of these assessments is extremely poor, as these reports show. So I would say the one takeaway is that the European Commission and the EU legislative bodies now have the chance to actually better this and show the way. And we'll see at the end of this year if this is actually the case or not.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Indeed, thank you, Ivan. I think my takeaway would be that indeed we need more and better governance of carbon removals in the EU. Responding also to the first question in the chat, we can't rely only on voluntary carbon markets to ensure quality, to ensure there's no mitigation deterrence. We need direction from governments, and after all, CDR is a public good and has to be addressed by governments and countries well. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. Thank you to our speakers. We will share, as said, the presentations and the recording. And we will be in touch for developments. Let us know if you have any feedback by email. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.